I've been a fan of our next guest for a long time, since she was writing for and part of leading a website called io9.com that covers science fiction and comics in the future and all that fun stuff. She's got Annalee Newitz. She's a journalist. She's an editor. She's author of both fiction and nonfiction. She has a great nonfiction book about the future. She has received a Knight Science Journalism Fellowship from MIT. I guess she is now the tech culture editor at Ars Technica, which I didn't even know. But I do know that her new science fiction book is entitled Autonomous. So first of all, Annalee, thanks for coming on the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And secondly, we're probably sick of talking about your new book, but rather than me try to summarize it, give a brief description, why don't you?
So it's set in the year 2144, and it's about a patent pirate, a pharmaceutical pirate who is selling pirated drugs that are super expensive she's selling them at low cost or no cost to people who can't afford it. And she kind of screws up. She's working outside the law. She makes a mistake that's pretty bad, and she gets on the radar of the company whose drugs she's been pirating. And so they send, through a series of kind of corrupt connections between corporations and government, they send a couple of government agents after her, one of whom is a freshly made robot named Paladin, and one is his human partner, Elias. And so it's a chase story. But a lot of it is about the politics of medicine and also about artificial intelligence and what will happen when we actually have sentient robots who are basically slaves.
So, I love that theme of the book, which I've just started to read because by mistake the email went to my daughter instead of me. And so I've just started to. I was hoping to have finished it by now. I got it sent to me. But I love that part of it, the issue of sentience and where you go with that. First of all, I have to ask, is Paladin, we know that's a historical term, but it's named after Richard, whatever his name was, and Have Gun Will Travel, Richard Boone?
You are only the second person to ask me that question, and congratulations on having a good cultural reference. But actually, Paladin is named after my favorite character class in D&D.
Okay, well, it's too bad because Richard Boone was sort of supposed to be this amoral gruff. Anyway, but that is hardly central to the thesis of your book. We cover the politics of pharmaceuticals a lot on this program, and I write about it a lot, so a lot of issues close to my heart. But one of the, I read an interview with you, Annalee, where you talked about the issues of predicting the future, and we're kind of exploring that in this week's program. So it's timely. Obviously, we can't know the future, but one of the things I liked, before we get into artificial intelligence, one of the things I liked was that you said, we always think about the new things that will come in the future, but we don't think about the unexpected things that will be preserved, like a shopping mall in the case of your novel, right?
It's true. And one of the ways that I approached the world building part of the novel and thinking about the future was to imagine how many generations into the future these characters would be, to kind of humanize it. And it's about 5 generations in the future. And so I looked back at the culture that would have been around 5 generations ago in the late 19th century and thought about how many commonalities there really are. People are still taking pictures and riding on streetcars, and those things look very different, but they're still part of our everyday lives. And so as I thought about tomorrow, I really did try to preserve some things that I think are likely to continue in 125 years. Like there's some version of the internet that's still around. People are still Googling on weird sex information, although they don't call it Google. And they're still struggling with a lot of the same social problems that we have today around healthcare, around sexual identity. And those problems, I don't see them just disappearing in that short of a time.
Yeah, economic inequality too. And, one of the interesting places you go with this, to me, Annalee Newitz, is in your book, and again, the book is entitled Autonomous. One of the interesting places you go is, okay, if we create artificial intelligences, and they're truly, and I personally don't know that that's a given that we'll ever do that, but should we create a real consciousness, we would be obliged to give it the rights of a conscious being. And that you get into a whole exploration, to me, that opens up all sorts of doors about, well, then how can corporations monetize a living being, and what implication does that have for humans? So I don't know if you want to talk about that a little or not, but I thought it was quite interesting.
Yeah, so one of the central ideas in my novel is that slavery has become a cornerstone of the global economy again. Of course, we don't call it slavery because that sounds yucky. So people call it indenture. They call it the human resources economy. I actually had a lot of fun coming up with all the euphemisms that people would use for reinventing slavery because, that's how you sell it. You brand it. And so what happens is robots achieve sentience. And I agree with you that I think it's very unlikely that we will have that kind of sentience, especially not that soon. But so that's, suspend disbelief. So robots become sentient and they're being manufactured by corporations. And so legal precedent says that these robots are now human equivalent. So the question is, how do corporations, as you said, how do they make money on making a living being? So a global coalition called the International Property Coalition comes up with this idea that robots can be indentured for up to 10 years by the company or government that makes them to pay off the cost of their manufacture. So a fundamental part of robot sentience is that they spend up to 10 years indentured for the first part of their lives. And of course, these laws are enforced, sometimes they're enforced well, sometimes they're barely enforced. A lot of these robots never see freedom and never become autonomous.
So you realize, just to jump in, Annalee, you realize that you've just invented student debt.
Yeah, well, I didn't invent student debt. I'm one of the many people who spent years and years and years of my life paying off student debt, and I worked as a undercompensated grad student researcher for a long time. So I'm familiar with the system of indenture as we know it today. And so my idea was that, well, if we have human equivalent robots who can be indentured, obviously clever corporate lawyers who want indentured humans would figure out a way to say, well, hey, in court, here's these human equivalent beings. Why can't humans also be indentured? And this could become a new human right, the right to be indentured. And so it comes to pass. And so by the time we reach the future that the novel takes place in, both humans and robots have the right to be indentured. And these laws that apply to the system are called the human rights indenture laws, because again, branding, marketing, we want it all to sound above board and great. And it was fun for me because this is kind of a twist on the usual idea of if you enslave robots, robots will rise up and enslave humanity. What happens here is when you enslave robots, you create a legal system that allows you to enslave humans as well. So we do reinvent human slavery by enslaving robots, but not really in the way that happens in, say, the Terminator movies or the Matrix films.
Well, yeah, and by the way, a couple thoughts about that. And again, we're talking with Annalee Newitz about her new novel, Autonomous. A couple thoughts about that. One is, first of all, the obvious term, I haven't encountered it in your book, but maybe it's there, for what you're describing is human capital, which is very popular now. In fact, I wanted to name a punk band Human Capital, but I couldn't get a majority
it
of 5
really is
people.
an extension of that idea, sort of taken to its logical extreme. I have characters refer to it as the human resources economy, and it was interesting because when I was building this world, I wanted to make sure that the economics made sense. And so I sat down with an economist, Noah Smith, and made him talk to me about what would it take to create a system where people felt like indenturing themselves was a good option. And one of the things he reminded me of was the fact that we actually have a lot of rights that we take for granted that we don't have to have, like the right to be able to work without paying first, or the right to be able to live someplace without paying first, the right to just be able to buy a house. And he's like, look, we have all these rights. We can move around within the country. We can do all these things. But those are just, those don't have to be there. And so my characters, when they're born, if their families are lucky and have money, they buy franchises in the cities where they live. And those franchises allow them to own a house there or rent there or work there or go to school there. But without that first purchase of the franchise, you have no right to even work in a place. And so if you're born without money or you're born with not enough money, you got to figure out how to survive somehow. And so that's why indenture starts looking really good for people who don't have franchise, people who are literally disenfranchised. And I don't think that that's unrealistic. I think that we don't realize how much of human history people haven't had those kinds of rights, and they simply couldn't, just go get a crappy job. They actually had to pay first to get the crappy job.
Right.
And so
again,
all those rights are gone in the future.
Yeah, and again, student debt. I mean, the other thing is, coming from my sort of, lefty perspective is in many ways we do indenture ourselves today. We indenture ourselves when we take on debt, whether student debt is the perfect, I think, analog for what you describe in your book for the artificial intelligences, but we indenture ourselves with consumer debt as well. And in order to maintain our credit rating, we indenture ourselves by making sure, in order to participate in that borrowing economy, by making sure that we're employed, even if we don't feel like working. We'd like to take 6 months off. We want to write a novel, a play, whatever, but we think we might want to buy a house or a car or keep our credit cards or whatever. So we have to keep working. Isn't that a form of indenture too?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, part of the motivation for me in writing this book was to dramatize the emotional cost of what it means to have to work under conditions that you don't choose. So what does it mean when your choices are work or work more? There's no other option. If you want to survive, you may end up spending the vast majority of your life doing things that you don't like with people you don't trust and never owning what it is that you create. And that's a really horrific, alienating experience, and it's very ordinary. It's something that people go through on many rungs of the economic ladder. It's much worse for people who are in poverty, but people in the middle class spend a lot of time creating, thinking thoughts that they wouldn't want to think, but they are paid to do it. And it's kind of hard to have to focus your attention all day long on something that you think is repulsive and boring. It's why people read IO9, right? They were looking for a distraction from their jobs. And a lot of people would tell us, like, yeah, I'm sitting here at work trying to reclaim a little happiness by clicking on things on the internet that are not part of my job. So, I think it's, this book is basically about the horror of alienated labor.
Yeah, and having spent years of my life at alienated labor, I definitely know what that's like. Well, so hopefully your new book is going to provide the alienated labor force of our indentured economy with some entertaining diversions, as well as a lot of stimulating ideas. Anything else people should know about the book?
I'm going to be on tour, so I'll be in D.C. and New York next week, and you can check my website for details. It's AnnaleeNewitz.com, and I hope to see some of you while I'm out on the road.
All right, great. Well, the book is Autonomous, a novel. The author and our guest is Annalee Newitz. Annalee, thanks for writing it, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.